Hi and welcome to my AQA Combined Science Revision Higher Level. So I'm going to look at homeostasis and response today, specifically focus on the blood glucose concentration and negative feedback. So you should know that your pituitary gland is a master gland which secretes several hormones into the body in response to body conditions. And you should know that the pituitary gland is part of your endocrine system. Now, the pituitary gland, when it secretes these hormones, what will happen is those hormones will be carried in your bloodstream until they reach the target cells. Once they are there, they will then bind to receptors in these glands, and that will produce an effect, whatever that effect may be. Now, hormones are much slower than nervous impulses, but the key thing about hormones is that they do act for longer. So, we're going to look to start with at your blood glucose concentration. So, you should know that high blood glucose concentration is detected by receptors in the pancreas, and they respond by secreting insulin into the bloodstream. Now, once the insulin reaches the cells, those target cells, which is virtually all your body cells, the insulin will then bind to these receptors. And what will happen is when the insulin binds to these receptors, it will first cause the cells to move glucose from the bloodstream into the cells. This will therefore lower the blood glucose concentration. Now, what happens to the glucose depends on what the cell requires. So it could be that the cell's going to do cellular respiration, where it uses the glucose and oxygen, and it does aerobic respiration within the mitochondria to produce water and carbon dioxide, and this releases energy for other processes to occur. Or it may be, if we're looking at the liver and muscle cells, that the glucose that's taken into the cell is then converted into glycogen, a large molecule which is a storage of energy. Now, if your pancreas is detecting high blood sugar levels, it should be releasing the insulin. Well, if you are type 1 diabetic, it means that your pancreas cannot produce enough insulin. Now, if it's not producing enough insulin, that therefore is going to result in your blood sugar levels remaining high. That becomes a problem. So what your body needs to do is it needs a way of counteracting that, because if you have a high blood sugar concentration, that will have an effect on the osmotic potential. So what happens is water will leave cells and water will therefore go into your bloodstream, and that will increase the concentration of water in your blood. When it does that, that's going to therefore affect the volume of blood, and you will result in going to the toilet more. So if someone is type 1 diabetic, what they'll actually be doing is removing glucose and excess water out of their body, and that actually is a problem. So therefore, someone who's type 1 diabetic will have to treat themselves with either using injections of insulin, or now they have special machines which will do the injections automatically. But the key thing is these injections of the insulin, what they're going to be doing is they are going to be doing the same thing, where they will bind to the receptors on the target cells and therefore lower the blood sugar levels. Now, if you're a type 2 diabetic, that is different, because that's not your body can't produce the insulin. Instead, it's that your body cells are not able to respond to the insulin. So the body cell receptors no longer respond to the insulin, therefore the glucose is not removed from the bloodstream. Now, if you are type 2 diabetic, there is a high risk factor of you ending up with obesity. And therefore, the types of treatment for someone who's type 2 diabetic is things like having a low carbohydrate diet. Glucose is a carbohydrate because it's containing carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens only. The other form is through the use of regular exercise, because when we exercise, we increase our aerobic respiration rate, and therefore we're going to increase the demand for that glucose. The glucose is used, it's no longer remaining in the bloodstream. So that's what happens when it comes to our high blood sugar levels and ways to treat that. Now, as a higher level student, you also need to know about what happens if your blood sugar levels get too low. And this is where the pancreas will release a new hormone called glucagon. I like to think of it as glucose agon. So the glucagon is released from the pancreas when the pancreas detects that the blood sugar levels are low. Again, it will be transported in the bloodstream, and when it gets to its target cells, which is the liver, it will then be able to bind. So when the glucagon is released from the pancreas, it travels in the bloodstream, and when it reaches the liver, what it will do is it will bind to those receptors on the liver cell. That will then cause the liver to start to break down that large molecule, the glycogen, down back into those small monomers, the glucose molecules. And then the glucose will then be able to be released back into the bloodstream, which will rise up that blood sugar levels. So what you have to understand is that this is actually a form of negative feedback. Negative feedback is where you have a stimulus which is going to provoke a response. That response should restore the balance by reducing the magnitude of the stimulus. So what we're basically saying is the stimulus is detected by a receptor. The receptor passes that on to the coordination center. The coordination center then passes that on to the effector, and this is going to bring our system back to normal. So if we have a stimulus that is increasing, the response should decrease. And if we have a stimulus which is decreasing, the response should be to increase that. So in the case of our blood glucose concentration, we have an ideal level where we want the blood glucose levels to be maintained. But actually what happens is it rises, it drops. It rises, it drops. And that is because the body is responding. So when our stimulus is an increase, the response would be the release of insulin, and that would therefore cause the body to remove the glucose from the bloodstream, and that is going to decrease the blood glucose concentration. If the stimulus is that the blood glucose concentration is now getting too low, the response is the release of glucagon, and then the blood sugar levels will rise up again. When we get too high again, then the insulin is released. So this is a form of negative feedback in the stimulus is provoking a response which restores the balance. And it's a fluctuation that's happening constantly throughout the day. So there are a few other hormones that you need to know about when it comes to your negative feedback system. And one of those is thyroxine. So your thyroid gland, which is located in your throat area, releases a hormone called thyroxine. Now, thyroxine is needed because thyroxine increases the basal metabolic rate, the enzyme activity, the oxygen use within tissue, and your brain activity. Thyroxine is really important because it is a specific hormone with a role in your growth and your development. So the body needs to be able to release thyroxine when that basal metabolic rate needs to increase, but it also needs to decrease the release of thyroxine when that basal metabolic rate gets too high. So this is down to negative feedback again, and this time we don't just bring in one gland, our thyroid gland, we also need to think about another gland, and that other gland is actually involved in the release of another hormone, which is called thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. Now, you don't need to know TSH, but you do need to know that it is a response that will happen based on the thyroxine level. So the pituitary gland was that master gland that we talked about earlier. The pituitary gland is the one that releases this hormone TSH. Now, if they're going to ask a question on this, they will expect you to be able to pull the information out from the stem of the question. But what is really important for you to understand is the thyroid gland is the one that releases thyroxine, and the thyroid gland in this release of thyroxine is under the control of negative feedback. If there is an increase in thyroxine levels, then the response will need to be a decrease in another hormone. Or what they might do is give a question like this: explain how the thyroid gland controls the response to a decrease in body temperature by negative feedback. If that's what they're asking, they're expecting you to know that the decrease in body temperature is going to have an effect on the thyroid gland and therefore the effect on the release of thyroxine. Now, what did thyroxine do again? It increased the basal metabolic rate. When you increase the metabolic rate, you are going to increase the amount of energy that is released. That will therefore increase the body temperature. So we are using a negative feedback system in that the body temperature has dropped down. There's our stimulus. We are going to respond by increasing the body temperature. Negative feedback. We are reversing, bringing the system back to normal. Well, what happens is when our body temperature increases, that actually signals for the decrease in the release of thyroxine. So therefore, what we have here is a negative feedback system, which is involved in not only the release of thyroxine, but also to do with the body temperature, which is one of our homeostatic control systems that needs to be maintained in the body. And the last one that you have to know about when it comes to your negative feedback system is the adrenal gland. So the adrenal gland is a gland which is going to release the hormone adrenaline. And adrenaline is released in response to stress or fear. Now, what happens is that adrenaline will then go in the bloodstream and it will bind to receptors. Now, the first place it's going to bind is with your heart, causing your heart to increase its rate of pumping. So we increase the heart rate. Now, by increasing the heart rate, we are going to result in a faster delivery of glucose and oxygen. And that faster delivery of glucose and oxygen is going to go to the brain and also to our muscles. What would that do? Well, glucose and oxygen is required for aerobic respiration. So we're going to be able to do more aerobic respiration within our cells and therefore prepare the body for the fight or flight response. So there are other things that the body does with this fight or flight response. Things like our pupils dilate. We have our heart rate increase, as I stated before. We also have an increase in our blood pressure. We have a dilation of our bronchioles in our airways. We get more air coming in, providing that oxygen. We have an increase in our breathing rate. We also increase that blood flow to the muscle, and we decrease the blood flow to other areas like your gut, your intestines. So I hope you've liked this video, and if you have, then please do click on the like button and subscribe to my channel.